Welcome back. My name is Jack Burgess. Most of you probably know that I finished my layout, which is based on the Yosemite Valley Railroad, in 2011. But I actually built 3 layouts before I did that. And in this presentation, I want to share those layouts and thoughts about what I've done since then. I was given a train set on my 13th birthday. It consisted of a power pack, an engine, some cars, and so forth, and track. No switches. I laid it out on a piece of plywood, ran it around and around, actually built a mountain across the whole top of it with paper and so forth. But I could not afford turnouts. And nowadays, I think kids get a lot more than we did. We got allowance and we got presents for birthdays and Christmas. We didn't get turnouts every month or something. And without turnouts, it wasn't much fun. I remember toward the very end, my friend and I would see how fast we can roll down the track and go through a curve without throwing the engine on the floor, and eventually put it away and went back to building plastic models. So my first layout was built in 1966. Here's a photo of it. It was 2 feet by 6 feet based on a plan in a model railroader, a fictitious railroad. Very simple. It was in an apartment in the bedroom when I built it. Basically was a switchback. The problem I had initially was that I could not afford a power pack or locomotive when I started building it. And I couldn't afford flex track, so I actually bought ties, and I apparently found an article in one of the magazines on how to actually lay track, but I didn't know how to build switches. So I bought a kit. They had a kit at those times that would give you the points and the frog and so forth. And I remember it was a real hassle to get that thing installed, and I didn't buy another one. There were only, I think, 3 turnouts on the whole layout. But I did finish all the scenery. I was also scratch building my equipment. Except for the locomotive, I scratch built the boxcars and so forth. I didn't know much. You can see that they're pretty simple. I named the railroad the Mad River Railroad based on a river up in Northern California. What I was doing at the time was using spray cans to paint them, and then I would letter them with individual letters, and then to weather them I would take another different color, maybe a lighter color, whatever, and aim the spray can right in front of the model, and it would blow up on top of it, and I thought it was pretty cool weathering, but of course it wasn't. I finally got rid of it and bought a hollow core door with some removable legs and built a switching layout on top of it. That way I could take the legs off and store it behind the door. We were in a very small apartment at the time. All the track was hand laid. I don't have any photos of it. I suspect it was quite a few turnouts. I didn't operate it, which if you have learned, I don't even operate my layout. But what I did is I had created a club fairly early on. There was a model railroad club here in the small town where I lived, but what we were expected to do was come once a month and help this guy build his layout. And every time we got there, there was so much junk on the layout from his kids that we spent a half an hour getting all the junk off. And we didn't make much progress on it. So I created a club called the Fiddletown and Copperopolis Historical and Switching Society. And all we did is visit each other's layouts for those that were building layouts and go see other layouts. For example, I got in touch with John Allen, and we went down to see John Allen's layout, which was very impressive in most ways. It was highly fictional. You would have 3 bridges crossing the same gully and so forth. But I finally realized what made him so popular was that his photos were really good. He was a professional photographer and had a large format camera. And he was even taking photos of his layout that would be in ads and so forth. So it was neat to see because it was very groundbreaking. He was the first person that ever did weathering, for example. About this time, I learned that there was a hobby shop up in Oakland, which was about 25 minutes away, that was giving clinics one night each month. And a friend of mine and I started going. It was unbelievable. The clinics were given by Russ Simpson, who owned the hobby shop. He had been one of the people, modelers, working on Star Wars. He was very interested in the Sierra Railroad. He He taught us how to handle a track, how to handle turnouts, how to scratch build with styrene, how to scratch build with wood, how to airbrush things, how to do weathering. Every month it was a different clinic. And some of them were kind of hands-on. He would do something, and then he would let you use his airbrush to learn how to airbrush things. I learned a lot from Russ, and it was a really worthwhile set of clinics. At that time, I realized I would get more satisfaction from building models of prototypes as opposed to what I had been doing. That led me to want to pick an actual prototype to model. What I did then is I first went to the library. Our library had a few books on prototype railroads, and I looked through those. One of them was the Sierra, and the Sierra seemed very interesting. It was close by and so forth, and it was still around. And I gave that a lot of thought. But the book that was available at that time, and as far as I knew, it was the only book. All the pictures were in the middle of it, and it was not a big book. And I realized if I was going to scratch build things, I needed a lot of photos. And so I decided not to do the Sierra. There was also a book on the Yosemite Valley Railroad, and it had a lot of photos. And it was in California. And I wanted a railroad in California because I didn't know what scenery looked like back east. And I didn't think I would ever be able to afford to go back there and take pictures of that kind of scenery. So California was good. It was a short line railroad and not the Southern Pacific or something. I could not afford brass engines in those days. So if I had picked Southern Pacific, I would have been very frustrated because at that time importers would just come in with something like an SP engine or something and sell it to the hobby shops, and you go into the hobby shop and there's a locomotive you can't afford. So I'd rather substitute or figure out some other solution. I didn't really have a solution to the engines, figuring out maybe I'll scratch build them or something. In 1967, I decided to model Yosemite Valley Railroad as accurately as possible using state-of-the-art techniques. And that sounds kind of a mission statement, which it was, because at that time I was working for the city of Newark, and many companies, including my employer, were making mission statements. What is our goal? Why are we here? And so that mission statement was basically saying, whatever you build it as good as you can. Build it to enter into a contest. And I kept that in mind the entire time I was building stuff. I still do. Do I want to, I can build this real quick. Or I could take more time and maybe add an interior if it's a building, do something and put it in a contest. On my 21st birthday, my parents gave me a copy of Hank Johnson's book on the Yosemite Valley Railroad. So here's that book. I've used it for so long. The cover came off. The pages are all still there. But what I actually did, since it was a reference, and it wasn't a book that I read once and I put it away, it has to be pristine. There are pages that Hank would have photos on both pages, and there was no page number. So I went through and added page numbers so I could make notes that, remember on page 61 is this photo. So eventually, I bought another copy. On Highway 41, which goes to Fresno, there is, within the national park, a development. It was probably private land. It remained private land, and it was sold to people that wanted to build their own houses. So if you go down at that development, you get on a road, and that is part of the original Yosemite Lumber Company grade. And you drive out about 5 miles right to the top of the logging incline, and that's where Hank had built a house. And so he was there 24/7, 365 days a year, but he knew everybody that worked in Yosemite National Park he knew. And I think what he did is he gave the park rights to publish his book forever and get the money off of it. So that was really nice. He passed away a few years ago, but I knew him as a friend for a long time. One of the things I wanted to do, and I continue to do, is to challenge myself. How can you make something better push yourself to do as good a job as you can, so forth. So that got me into contest modeling. And when contest modeling, I'm talking about the National Model Railroad Association meets. There's here in the Bay Area, there's a local, and we get together every quarter, I think it is. And I actually became in charge of the contests and those people that judge contests. And my wife became a judge. But the competition here in the Bay Area, especially early on, was really high. Bob Brown, who's the editor of the Gazette, had been a contest model, I think, but his models were always that level. Gordon Cannon was also a contest modeler, and he actually scratch built completely everything for a narrow gauge Shay on the west side. He took it to the national contest, which was in London that year, and took a first place, of course. First place of every model in the contest. So I started thinking about getting into contest modeling as a way to make myself take the time to do things as good as I could. So this is the very first model that I built along those lines. It was 15. I did all the interior and so forth. It's all scratch except for the trucks and couplers. And there was a regional contest coming up here in the Bay Area. I could not afford to go. I think the entrance fee probably would have been $50 or something, but it was beyond my means. So Bob Brown took it for me, entered into the contest, and I took a first place in Caboose Novice, which were models by modelers who had not entered that category before. So first place, great. 86 points out of 125. I might have been the only model in that contest. That they would still, if there's only one, they're still going to give it a first place. So that was my very first contest entry. Sometime after that, I started working on my model of the 330 observation car, which you've seen in the last video. I entered that also in a regional contest and international. Again, Bob Brown went to those meets, entered it for me, took a first place in both the regional and the national. And that time I had a pretty good score, I think 103 or something out of 125. In 1971, I moved into this house, which let me start a layout in the garage based on the Yosemite Valley Railroad. But it was only a practice layout, and that's what it was intended to do. It went around three sides of the garage, and it was a means to learn how to better hand lay track, how to do bench work, how to do wiring, how to do scenery. I had never done scenery yet. Well, that very first layout, but that didn't count. For example, spline roadbed was very popular at the time, or becoming popular. And so I built part of it with spline, but I didn't think it was worth the effort. To build that layout, I also had to start doing some research because I needed to eventually know what the railroad looked like, where it ran, what sections it was, what the trees looked like, everything about that. So getting started on scenery, here's a photo that I took years ago. It was from the road, and you can see a creek there, Edendale Creek. And if you look carefully, you can see bridge abutments. I'm including this photo because the grass in California in the summer is yellow. It is not green. It doesn't rain during the summers here, and so the grass turns yellow. And if you look in this photo, you can see in the background especially the color of our grass. So one of the things I had to learn how to do was how to make grass and color it. I had never seen an article about doing grass. There were a couple photos in RMC on 2 different months of maybe one of these photos that people send in to the magazine showing their layout. And at that days, it was all black and white. But I could tell that this guy was modeling California-like grass. And somehow, I know I didn't get in touch with him, but somehow I learned that he was using a blocking product that was being sold out of Southern California. So I got some and added it to this layout, painted it with a mishmash of Floquo colors, and came up with this. Now this is a photo that was in an article that I wrote for RMC apparently after they started doing color, on how to model grass. In hindsight, looking at it today, I'm not that impressed with the colors. Here's another photo of another location on the layout, and this is actually a model of Edendale Creek. I modeled Edendale Creek on this layout because when I first went down to visit the railroad in about 1965, that bridge was still there. Tracks were, of course, gone, but I actually measured it up and built a model of it. And I think in this photo, the colors are better than the other photo, but I still had some work to do. I also got into operations on that layout, although not like you would think. There were diagrams coming out in the magazines on building your own transistorized throttle because transistors were suddenly available. And so I built one, and then I built the steam cab that you've seen. But also what I did is, I've mentioned these before, but I actually found one. These are working switch stands that I built, and I had a panel on the layout, the front of the layout, so the layout was up here, and if you're going to throw the switch, you actually have to walk up and throw it. I built them out of brass track, and so you solder them together and so forth. Not long after I decided to model the YV, I realized I needed to pick a month and a year to model. There are a number of factors that I considered. One was equipment. If I picked something back in the 30s or earlier, I would not have as many photos to be able to model, so I wanted to pick something a little bit later. The Depression was on for part of that time, and it was getting better, at least in California, toward the very end of the 30s, so I was kind of leaning toward the end of the 30s. Another factors were the logging company. The logging company was started in 1912, and they shipped their logs over the YV, which I wanted to model. But they went out of business, or shut down, I should say, a couple times, and they finally got back into business in 1935 and went out of business in 1942. So that gave me a window of just those years. I didn't want to get into the war years. The United States didn't get into the war until 41, so I picked 1939. And I also wanted to pick a month. Many people think that's really silly, but if you look in my station, you can see an August 1939 calendar in there. And more importantly, if we're going to have operations and I'm issuing train orders, you have to have a date on it and a month. And I wanted to model the summer months, so I picked August, so August 1939. Road signs and traffic striping are also impacted by the year you model. So if you're modeling from about 65 or so to current day, you would have yellow stripes for traffic going both directions. Before that, it was white. Everything was white. Even double yellows were double whites originally. Traffic signs have changed. Nowadays, they're universal, like we see. Maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, they would have been different. Stop signs. I read an article in the Narragansett Shortline Gazette decades ago now, and the guy was modeling yellow stop signs, and he was modeling something back in the 30s or something. And I thought, oh, that's cool. So I put yellow stop signs on my layout. Then I learned California actually adopted the red stop signs in 1928. So I switched back to red stop signs. Now here's a photo of a stop sign on my layout, and a couple of things are interesting. First is you'll notice it's not like current day signs where the letters are a reflective material. They actually had little reflectors to show the letters, so when you come up at nighttime, you could see stop and read it. Now in California, up until the 60s, the American Automobile Association, AAA, installed traffic signs in cities. If it was a state highway, the state did it. But in our city, I remember when I went to work in 65, I would still find signs, and I didn't know why at the time, that would have a little AAA logo on the bottom of that sign. That sign on my layout has a AAA logo. I was fortunate because about that time or somehow I was researching stop signs or traffic signs, and I found a website of a guy who collected signs. He didn't steal them. They were out of date or whatever. And his garage, like our garage, which is a huge layout, he had signs, original traffic signs, all over the back of the thing. And so he had close-ups, so I was able to take those, and that's where I got the image for the stop sign on my layout. One of the things I did early on is I needed to find out where the railroad went. From the book, there was a kind of a sketch, but I didn't know exactly where it was located. So one of the first things I did is I went to USGS. This is before computers, and they had an office across the bay from where I live, and I went in and bought 13 USGS maps that covered the entire length of the railroad. And those were updated in 1947, which means they would make any changes and then print new maps. And the railroad only went out of business in 1945. So a lot of the route was labeled as old railroad grade on the maps. So what I did is I then took a ink pen. I was also a draftsman, and we drew plans in ink and went through and highlighted the entire route from one end to the other. So you can see that on this drawing, that I've also marked mileposts. So for example, I knew where milepost 1 was, which was at the station in Merced. Milepost 47 was near Bagby, and Highway 49 crossed right next to the station. So that gave me, I would kind of use dividers and click, 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 and walk up the roadbed. And every once in a while, I would say, okay, it's pretty close, but I need to move this back. So then I was able to mark all the mileposts on them. So these have been handy for a lot of reasons. Not only, well, the major one is knowing exactly where the railroad had been located, because it was all abandoned. So I was able to trace, go out in the field and find exactly where it had been in most of the places. Not sure where I got this, but this is an 1897 USGS map. It's a much smaller scale, so you get a lot more track per sheet. But what it does is it shows the original location of the railroad, where 17 miles of it was relocated in the 20s. So if you zoom in on it, you can actually see where the railroad was. The Merced Irrigation District was responsible for paying for the cost of relocating 17 miles of the railroad in the early 20s to build a huge dam. That work included 4 tunnels and 5 big steel bridges. So I was able to get plans from the irrigation district of those structures, which is kind of cool. I don't remember what state agency had these, but some agency in California had these maps, and I was able to go up and get copies of them. These were maps that were drawn by the railroad in 1916 for the entire length of the railroad. They show all the bridges, tunnels, and so forth. So here's one of these maps. This is milepost 47 right here, milepost 48. This is the Bagby Bridge. Up here's another bridge. Here's a dam on the river. And this was the general location of Bagby. In fact, there's the siding and the house track, and there's the station. Sandbar maps were created so that fire insurance companies could provide coverage to businesses that were not local. You might have a major insurance company, and how do they predict what the insurance cost should be in Merced or somewhere else? So here's an example. The original maps were all in color. You also need a key because there are symbols on these maps that would tell you what the building was built from, how many windows there are in it, all this kind of stuff. The key is available from a number of places online. The Library of Congress has a collection of these, all color, and they are slowly adding more and more color copies. When Sanborn Maps went out of business, every state got a full set of these maps for that state. California got 2 sets, one in Northern California, one in Southern California. Not sure where the one in Southern California is, but the one in Northern California is at UC Berkeley, which is about 20 or 30 minutes from here. And so I was able to go up there and get copies of all of the Sanborn maps for Merced. Here's a portion of a Sanborn map for Merced, which shows the structures in the yard, the turntable, the roundhouse, and so forth. And if you look down at the bottom of this in this close-up, you can see a little building, and it's labeled Oil House, H-O. And you might remember that I talked about building 3 of those buildings before I got it right. The first 2, I had the doors on the outside. You can see here that the door is in a breezeway between this building and the stores building. And so with that, I was able to actually get it right. 2006, I purchased on eBay a pin used by employees of Yosemite Lumber Company. As shown on this photo, I think it was for them to get into the mess hall because the whole town was a company town. And I think that was part of either their benefits or they didn't pay much for dinner, something, I'm not sure. So I actually have 2 of them shown here. This is a display case we have in our living room. And one of these 2, I don't remember which one it was, but the seller emailed me and asked me why I spent so much money for this little pin. I know I bought one of them for $53, and I think the other one was $125 or so. And I explained my interest in Yosemite Valley Railroad, and he says, well, then I have something special that I'm going to send you for free. So here's what he sent me. This is a map of Merced Falls where the lumber company was located. It is not a Sanborn map. Sanborn never did anything up in Merced Falls. So I think this is maybe the only copy of this map that is still around. The seller told me that his father worked for a company that scrapped the entire town after 1942 when they shut down. So it shows all of the buildings, shows the tracks, shows everything, even the residences and so forth. Very cool map. So when I was writing my book here on the Yosemite Valley Railroad, I was able to use that map to prepare this drawing, and it shows all the buildings. These were homes for families and so forth. A lot of information. Many prototype modelers have probably heard of railway equipment registers. This is one. These were put out quarterly, and what they were used for, generally, my understanding is if you were a shipper, you would call the railroad and tell them, I need such and such a car. And the agent would then find a car of that size, quantity, and so forth, and maybe going back to where your company was, whatever, and find the equipment you need and get it out to you so you can get it loaded and shipped and so forth. So here's the interior of it. What was needed by the agent and what is so valuable to prototype modelers is they list the size of the cars. Now these are always interior dimensions, the width, the length, the height, door openings, and so forth. But with some estimating, you could actually draw up plans for these cars. Yosemite Valley Railroad, and now is Railway because in 1937 they changed from railroad to railway. But I knew that when I selected 1939, and a YV fan, Al Rose, sent me a letter teasing me, don't you know that it should be Railway because you're picking it 40? Well, I told him I know that, but I like railroad. It sounds like a railroad. Railway starts sounding kind of strange to me. But anyway, they were in this book even though they never interchanged their cars. Their cars were not allowed to leave the YV. And they even listed their passenger cars. So this is some really good information. It was able to come up with some general dimensions on some of these cars and so forth. So some neat information. When I was talking about choosing my railroad based on the fact that the book that was available had a lot of photos, I thought that every photo that had been taken of the railroad was in that book. Very naive. I didn't realize there were rail fans, actually, until much later in my life. And they would not only go photograph things, they would set up days where they would have a special ride. The YV had 2 of those, where they invited everybody to come on a certain day, They were not running regular passenger trains those days. It was mixed trains. And Al Rose set both of them up. Can you imagine inviting people all over California to come ride on a railroad with no internet, no phones? It was all by letter and word of mouth. And they've got a bunch of people to show up and enough people so that the railroad decided to run and so forth. So there were a lot more photos out there. And I didn't know that until early on, maybe 1970 or so, somewhere around there. I was given another photo of the YV, and here's that photo. A very poor photo. It shows an engine kind of out of focus, and it's up where it's going to be scrapped. So that got me going, and I realized that those rail fans that were taking pictures, a lot of them were still alive. Fortunately, about this time, I went to a meeting of the Railway Historical Society, and a lot of rail fans were there. So I was probably in my mid-20s, only person in the room out of probably 100 people that was that young. So no one was talking to me because they knew I wasn't a rail fan. But fortunately, there was a person at our table, and as I recall, he was a principal of an elementary school. And he started talking to me, and I told him my interest in the Yosemite Valley Railroad and so forth. And he said, well, have you ever met Fred Stowes? I think he took a lot of pictures of the YV. He lives in Santa Cruz, which is about an hour away. And he said, next time I write him a letter, remember, no emails in those days, I'll mention your name and tell him he'll get in touch with you and come over and see you. So I did that about a month later. And he was a good photographer. He gave me contact prints of 63 YV photos. And when I say good, I remember another person, I got a bunch of his photos. He could not focus a camera. One guy who was very good, and this guy rail fanned the YV one day. They followed it all the way from one end to the other. They would stand next to each other. One guy would take a great photo. The other guy, it was terrible. So that got me going. So what I did, Hank Johnson's book had only been out for 4 years. I wrote to Hank and asked for contact information, addresses, names and addresses, for people who had contributed photos or he had gotten photos from, and started writing letters. And one of them was Bob Leno. I wrote a letter to him, and I told him I wondered if I could borrow his negs. And fortunately, that month, one of the magazines came out with my model of the steam cab, and he happened to buy that. He was not a model railroader, but he happened to buy that issue. And so he wrote back and said, well, you look like somebody I can trust, so I'm going to send you all my negs. And this was about November. And so I wrote back and I said, well, as soon as I get them, I'll let you know. And they didn't come. And they didn't come. And I thought, he mailed them. Could accuse me of stealing them. And I wrote back and said, so-and-so. And he says, oh, I haven't mailed them yet because Christmas coming up, I don't want to get lost in the mail. So in January, I got them. I made prints. And in those days, I could actually rent time in a camera store. They had a dark room, and you could take and do your own prints. And I learned how to do that. And so I made all my own prints and so forth. So from there, it just kept growing and growing. Another person I contacted was Ted Worm. He wrote a couple of books. One of them was on the Hetch Hetchy Railroad, which had built a dam and dammed up that river. And the name of his book was The Hetch Hetchiness Dam Railroad, which I always thought was a great title. It's been reprinted, and they changed the title of it. But he actually was up there photographing the YV after it had been abandoned, while it was being torn up. So he took his photos in 1946. He actually worked at a camera store that had a darkroom, and he didn't develop his negs until 1949, and he'd never printed them. And so he said, yeah, I'll loan you my negs, but give me a print of each one that you make a print of. Deal, done. And he had some good photos. This is one of them, obviously taken during the scrapping. Here's all these mileposts that had been torn out and so forth. Originally, I was only collecting photographs and had them in binders like this. The amount of binders got more and more and more. but I also had an indexing system. And you can see right here my index number. I set up the thing so that the first 2 digits were the location or the subject. So it could be stations. Stations were 01 to 31 for the first 2 digits. Then I went box cars, log cars, flat cars, cabooses, observation cars, engines. Each engine was a different one. That gave me 3 digits for the picture itself. So the first picture in Merced would be 01001 and so forth. I set that up in a spreadsheet like this and logged the number of the photo, the group name, Merced, for example, the date, if I knew it when it was taken. Sometimes I would know the year or actual date. The photographer, if I knew it. And a lot of times I would get photos. Somebody would say, here's some photos, and I didn't even know, they didn't know who had taken them. And then finally a note on what it was in more detail. So that helped a lot. So then I switched to scanning, and I scanned all the photos I already have, and then I set up contact sheets for all the scans, like this. So this, again, has the image of it and the name, or the number. So what I can do is, if I'm looking for a photo of a flat car, something I want to build, I can go through this section on flat cars and see what I've got, and then pull up the scan, blow it up, and make a print, 8 by 10 prints or whatever I need. Or if I'm submitting them to a magazine, then I've already got them scanned. All I got to do is send the scan. Right now, I'm getting close to 4,000 photos of the Yosemite Valley Railroad. That's it for this time. Be sure and tune in next time for the rest of the story.